Big stack of books tonight. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Okay, last week we were off, and tonight we transition into Dr. Ian McGilchrist's magnificent and magisterial work, The Matter with Things. I just want to give a bridge to that. So obviously the first 6 weeks we've been talking about Charles Taylor and a secular age, and that is a philosophical and historical analysis of how the world has changed, why it's changed, and how that has affected our perception of reality. In essence, it's a question of, do we experience the world that we live in its totality as a sacred world, as a world filled with spirit, with meaning? Are there spirits in the world, whether good spirits or bad spirits or fairies or whatever it happens to be? Do we live in a world charged with meaning? Or do we live in a world, and this is really the story of modernity, where we've sort of disenchanted the world, we've put on the blinders to the spiritual aspects of things, and we've essentially said the world exists for itself. The world exists for human flourishing. And so our entire way of experiencing our lives in the world and the meaning of the world itself is that it no longer has a meaning inherent to itself that points to God, but rather it simply exists, whether by accident and chance or by a sort of clockmaker deist God who set it all up and designed it, but is otherwise not involved in it. And matter is simply matter through and through. And there's no awe or wonder or meaning in the world but what we give it so that we can live better, all right? That's in a nutshell the transition from an enchanted medieval world and everything before that, pre-modern world, to the world of modernity, which is a massive shift in perspective, a massive shift in the way we perceive things. And this is really McGilchrist's main way of looking at this, but from a totally different angle. He's going to look at it from the angle of neuropsychiatry and neurobiology. But I want to back up a second and give a bridge to McGilchrist from Taylor so that we can understand the stakes of what we're talking about. And that is to talk a little bit about nominalism. Does anyone here remember learning about the philosophy of nominalism in school? If you do, you probably have no idea what it is, because I know that every time I hear the word nominalism, I panic, because I can never remember what exactly it means. It's one of these really slippery, really subtle ideas. It's not that subtle, but there's a plain way of thinking about it. And in some ways, I've just articulated it. And the issue of nominalism, first of all, is associated with the sort of late medieval world moving into modernity, and it's associated with William of Ockham. William of Ockham is also famous for Occam's razor, which many people in the scientific community use Occam's razor all the time. Does everyone remember what Occam's razor is? Yes, a few of you that are more from the STEM areas of life, though he meant it philosophically and theologically in its original context. But in many ways, William of Ockham forms the foundation of how we do science. What William of Ockham said was this: before him, and as part of that pre-modern world, as part of that enchanted world, everyone took for granted that things had meaning inherent to themselves, that there was the idea of an idea inherent in the being of all things that finds itself fulfilled in the divine Logos, the second person of the Trinity, right? In him all things hold together. In him all things are created. In him through him, by him all things were created. That means all created things point to Christ, right? This is an inherent aspect of the Christian worldview, of a biblical worldview, of a sacramental worldview, of how we experience the world. No matter where we are out there, all things point to Christ if we know how to look at it. And I've described this before as this also somewhat slippery and difficult for us to understand notion of Orthodox spiritual ascetical life, which says that when you move from the stage of purification to the stage of illumination, being illumined by the Holy Spirit, one of the things that is meant by that is we begin to perceive the meaning of the inner essence of all things, right? Remember I told this story and I had a friend who was like, please explain that to me. He was not Orthodox. Please explain that to me because I don't understand. Like, are you saying every single rock or piece of rock I find in the world has some kind of divine meaning behind it, right? And so it's another one of these slippery things, but it's a realization that everything that has been created in, through, and for, and by Christ. And therefore, all things find their meaning and their teleology, their fulfillment in Christ, okay? So that meaning exists within all things as a virtue of being created by the Creator and the way that they were created. Now, nominalism says this. Nominalism says, phooey, that doesn't make sense. We think that meaning is not inherent to the thing itself, but comes from the outside. Initially, things have meaning only because God gives them names. And meaning and naming are associated. That's also a very biblical idea. We could really go down an interesting path of looking at the connection between meaning and naming in the Bible. But what William of Ockham is saying is that there's no meaning inherent to things. Things receive a meaning when God speaks their name. Thus, nominalism, right? Nomina is name. So it is in the name of a thing, meaning it only receives meaning after it's been designated or given a meaning from the outside of itself. And what happens in the scientific method is that not only do things receive meaning from God, therefore, but it shifts our understanding of the way the world is and the what of the world is and the matter with things, which we're getting to, so that we too can give meaning and purpose to material creation according to our own will, right? We can cut down a forest to make room for a shopping mall because we say so, right? There's nothing sacred about nature. There's nothing sacred about trees. There's nothing sacred about the landscape. Everything is there for the taking for our own human flourishing. This is a massive shift in how we understand the way things are. Does that make sense to everybody? Instead of assuming that the world is sacred and filled with God, and therefore we have stewardship of it and must treat it as being expressive of its relationship to God, we can simply use it however we want. We can name our own meaning and value to it. And this becomes, therefore, a way of the human being stepping out of the created order and making a philosophical claim to observe it as from above and describe it and give meaning to it according to our own will. It leads to somewhat of the paradox of the scientific worldview that says that the human being is simply, eventually, a simple accident from within creation, but who nonetheless has an otherwise inexplicable ability to stand outside of creation and determine what the meaning of that creation is, right? In other words, to stand in the place of God. So this is nominalism. It's a change in the way we relate to things. And this brings us to Ian McGilchrist. Where's my glasses? Ian McGilchrist, I do want to read a little bit of his credentials before we look at some of the works that we'll be working through. This is a magnificent book called The Matter with Things, okay? When I first got this in the mail the first time, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. It's also the heaviest book I think I've ever bought. Obviously, it's in 2 volumes, but it's just beautifully printed. And unlike when I said about Taylor, like, yeah, Taylor's heavy philosophy, if this is not your cup of tea and you don't usually read that, don't worry about buying that kind of book. I personally think everyone should own this book. All right, I'm just going to go on record and say that, because I think it'll change your life. And I don't know of anyone who hasn't picked this book up and begun to read it who hasn't just been sort of gobsmacked at the insights that it contains about the nature of reality and that from a man who is avowedly agnostic. McGilchrist does not come to us as a professing Christian. He is from the British Isles. He lives on the Isle of Skye, right behind Talisker, for those of you who enjoy Scotch. That is his neighborhood. The mountain behind him is Talisker Mountain. So he does find great value in worship, particularly worship in the Anglican tradition. And in some of the videos that I will send out as part of this next section of our course over the next 6 weeks, you'll hear him speak about this, because despite the fact that he's an agnostic, his work has really resonated very deeply with those who are concerned with the sacredness of the world because of what he says about it. But he comes to it from a very scientific point of view. He would probably call himself, in this sense, an evolutionary neurobiologist, okay? So let me give you just a few aspects of his, this is in 2 volumes, so I have to pay attention to what I'm picking up here. I do think for our benefit, it's helpful to know what his credentials are. He is a psychiatrist, a neuroscience researcher, a philosopher, and a literary scholar. That is, when we call him a polymath, it's because he's bringing lots of different traditions together, and he's a master of all of them. Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College, Oxford, a Fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, former consultant psychiatrist and clinical director at the Bethlehem Royal and Maudsley Hospital in London. He's been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore, and a fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Stellenbosch. In other words, this is a very learned man with extremely deep credentials in the academic and scientific community, who has been writing about these things now for probably about 2 decades, and has a lot of very interesting things to say. That is who he is. Let me tell you a little bit, though, about the work that he's done. So in 2009, he wrote this work, The Master and His Emissary, which is also a big book as well. If you had to pick one, I would just get The Matter with Things. The Matter with Things is about 1,500 pages. This adds another 500 some pages. The bibliography is a couple hundred pages on its own. He wrote this in 2009, and then he really spent the next decade following that up with this book, The Matter with Things. And I want to just point out the title, The Master and His Emissary. The subtitle is The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Now, I want to break that down for a second. The making of the Western world. That's exactly what we've been talking about with Taylor, right? How did our world get to be the way that it is, so that now it's easy not to believe in God, easy not to pay attention to the sacredness of the world, easy for us, all of us, to live essentially bifurcated lives. Even if we have faith, even if we practice our faith, we still find ourselves stretched and cross-pressured, is the language he uses, to live on the one hand outside these walls, very secular lives, attending to the world as if it exists for itself as good nominalists, and we are. Despite the fact that our tradition is not, we live as if nominalism is true. That's the making of the Western world. And so what he is suggesting is that there's something about the way we perceive the world that makes it seem to us to be the way that it is. And this is something that Taylor describes a lot when Taylor describes that secular person who believes that they perceive the world simply the way that it is, right? This is the delusion, I think, of the secular mindset. We simply see matter the way matter is. We look and we don't see sacred order. We look and we don't see the way that it connects to the Logos of God. We just take it as it is, and we're realistic about it, okay? What Taylor has proven to us, I hope we can see that, and I encourage further reading if that floats your boat, is that that is a construct. And what McGilchrist is saying is that that is actually a consequence of paying attention to the world in a very particular way, and that is through the divided brain. The title, The Master and His Emissary, then refers to the divided brain, and what he's saying is that there is a part of our brain that is meant to be the master, and there's a part of our brain that is meant to be the emissary or the servant, and we're going to unpack that over the next 6 weeks. How many of you, just by way of introduction, how many of you can remember there was a sort of a popular way of describing people in their types, was saying, oh, that person is very left-brained, right? Oh, that person's very right-brained. And how many of you recall hearing for the first time, no, we don't do that anymore? Has anyone heard that? Okay, so what we're talking about here is this idea that became very popular, which is that there is different functions of the two sides of our brain, and that left-brain people tend to be very analytical, very rational, non-emotional, able to break problems down and very soberly assess the solution to the problem. And the assumption was left-brain people are highly trustworthy because they're dealing only with the facts, and they don't let emotions and creativity and complications sort of sway them away from the facts. So that's a left-brained kind of person, is a person who's very comfortable in STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. Some of us here are STEM people, very left-brain field, okay? Right-brain people, on the other hand, are your creative types. They're your poets. They're the dreamers. They're more emotional. They're less trustworthy because they allow their emotions to cloud their judgment and that sort of thing. And so we tended to talk this way about left-brain people and right-brain people because it seemed like a helpful and more or less accurate depiction of why people sort of did things the way that they did. If you've watched The Big Bang Theory, for instance, on TV, anyone familiar with that television program? Been on forever. It's very much a show of left-brained people. It's all about left-brained people, right? These people that are mathematicians, high-level mathematicians and scientists, tend to be very left-brained people. All right, here's the problem. Several years ago, the memo came out to the world that said, stop doing that, that's all garbage, that's not the way it works. You shouldn't say that someone's left-brained or right-brained. In fact, the whole brain is used in apprehending all acts of knowing or understanding. And these kinds of differences and distinctions aren't accurate. What McGilchrist says in The Matter with Things is that's why he wrote this book, okay? He wrote this book to address this issue because, in a sense, both those narratives that we have from before, there are left-brain people and right-brain people, and this is the way they are, and that's all bunk, we don't do that, both of those are wrong, okay? Both of those are wrong in their own way. Because, in fact, what this book is about, and what both of these volumes are about, is the fact that our brains are indeed asymmetrical. We both, all of us, and all mammals for that matter, and even all the way down to insects, we all have brains that are asymmetrical, meaning that different portions and sides of the brain do different things, and the way that they do them matters. And this is what McGilchrist has sort of taken all of his research and all of his approach to things to reveal to us how we attend to reality tends to influence what we see and how we see it. And he would say that we have made a world in modernity that has privileged a left hemisphere approach to reality as being the most trustworthy way of describing the way things simply are, right? That language that Taylor has been using for us the last 7 weeks, of saying not so fast. What McGilchrist is going to say is this is true, and here's the problem. So in this book, there's a couple of different subtitles. The Matter with Things. Remember this whole idea we opened up with nominalism. What is a thing, and where does meaning come from? Well, The Matter with Things, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. The unmaking of the world. And what he's arguing for is a way of looking at the world, that the way we look at the world has been unduly influenced by a particular way of looking at the world that has led us into delusion. That we don't, in fact, experience reality the way reality actually is. And that we do indeed need to use the whole brain to do that, but that the brain has two sides, and one is the master and one is the servant. In essence, he would say that the left brain is an excellent servant but a terrible master. And so what was wrong with that old idea, there are left brain people and they're analytical and rational and very trustworthy. It's the trustworthy part that got us tripped up. Because the left brain is very good, and we're going to go through a list of what both hemispheres do here in a moment. I do want to say, I'm not a scientist. I am certainly not a neurobiologist. And if you are interested in these things, again, I think that no matter what, you should buy this book. It is a little expensive. You can still get it in hardback off of Amazon. I checked. The hardback is $120. You can get it in softback for $62-something. I recommend the hardback because I think you'll read it for years. Not cover to cover, but as a reference work. I think it's that important. How did I get on that? The left brain is really good at understanding the components of things, but it's not good at understanding the way that the details integrate with the whole. That's what the right brain does, okay? And so there's a master and his emissary, and we need both. This isn't one type of brain person is better than another type of brain person. That is not what he's saying, and that's not what we're saying. We actually need both sides of our brain to function. It's just that we live in a world that has privileged a left brain relation to reality. And that links back to this nominalist question. How the starting point of what a thing is and where a meaning resides determines the way that we pay attention to it, okay? So let me just, one of the things that's really challenging about this is that this is a book that is so intimidating when you first look at it, and you get it in the mail, and it weighs like 25 pounds, and it's just so long and it's so big, and yet you start reading it and you can't stop. McGilchrist is a marvelous writer, and everything he's doing here, he's doing in a very accessible way. So I cannot, again, I just think that everyone should understand this. But the reason why we're reading it, not only as a follow-up to Taylor's way of telling the story of how the world got to be the way that it is for us, the reason why we're reading it is that a lot of what McGilchrist is describing is really lockstep with an Orthodox perception of reality. The difference is that he's looking at it from the perspective of neurobiology. And this is crucial, absolutely crucial, because it's very exciting. And other writers have noticed this as well and are very excited about it as well. One I did want to pitch as well to that is this book that just came out last Tuesday. This is called Living in Wonder, Finding Mystery and Meaning in a Secular Age. I had no idea this book was coming out. It's by Rod Dreher, and I mentioned Rod Dreher 2 weeks ago. We were talking about the Benedict option. In fair disclosure, I have met Rod before. He is an Orthodox Christian. He was a member of St. Seraphim's Cathedral in Dallas, so I did meet and speak with him before he moved to Baton Rouge. I'm not sure where he lives now. Worked and wrote for many years for the American Conservative. Anyone familiar with the American Conservative? Very solid website of sort of conservative politics and social issues and foreign policy and that sort of thing. He doesn't work for them anymore. He's described here as a New York Times bestselling author. He's written several books. So this book is essentially this class. That's the amazing thing. And it was just published last Tuesday. All right, so I've had it for a few days. And what's interesting to me is that I discovered McGilchrist through sort of Amazon algorithms. You know, because I was interested in other things, Amazon said, we think you'll be interested in this book. Matter with Things, I think, was published in 2021. So I get it, and I start reading it, and I'm like blown away by it. It's just so incredible. Where has this guy been? You know, like my whole life. Really, really amazing stuff. I Google, like, who else is reading him, who's talking about him, and Rod Dreher picks up, and Rod Dreher did an extensive interview with Ian McGilchrist in relationship to this book, and it features heavily. He's asking the same questions we're asking here. How do we live and find mystery and meaning in what? A secular age. Yes, he does reference Charles Taylor, not as much as McGilchrist, but man, this is unbelievable. So if you want the sort of like, follow up to what we're doing over these 18 weeks of reading these 3 books, I highly recommend this. Very well written. I've read the first few chapters, and really great. But here's Rod, and he's reading McGilchrist, and he's seeing the same thing. And this is why McGilchrist is kind of all over the place online now, being interviewed by a whole range of different platforms because what he's saying is so important. What's hard about McGilchrist is he writes so well that his own words, like, you can't improve upon them. And one of the things you can't and shouldn't do, or at least one of the things I feel that I shouldn't do, is try to treat his book in the typical left brain sort of way of let me break this down and systematize it and compress it and pull out the kernels for you and that sort of thing. That I think, he expresses that he wrote these books specifically as a journey so that we would go on this journey reading through this book and come to a different way of seeing the world. Very, very fascinating. So I'm sort of struck by how difficult this is. Let me just see what time we have. What I want to do is talk about 20 ways that we can understand the bifurcated brain. The fact that our brains have 2 hemispheres, that they are different, that they do different things. Yes, they are meant to work together, but they don't attend to the world in the same way. And in order to understand this thesis, we're going to have to sort of lay out some of that. So we're going to be doing that over the next 2 sessions here of laying out how our understanding of the way our brains work influences the way we perceive what is true. Taylor helped us to identify why it is that we think something is good or not. What McGilchrist is doing is talking about the neurological basis of truth, which is really, really fascinating. But there are some things that I think need to be said. Let me do this. Before we go into the 20 things, let me say probably the thing that's most important. And that is that when it comes to the matter of things, and we talk about the scientific point of view, there are 2 basic positions that he is not associating himself with in terms of how different fields of science approach the nature of reality. One, which he calls naive realism, is more associated with biology and biologists. And naive realism says that there is a world that has meaning completely apart from our human perception and human participation. It just exists out there. Like all things are real and they simply exist, okay? That probably doesn't sound like a very difficult thing for us to believe, right? I know that when I die, the world doesn't disappear, right? I mean, this is another way of explaining it, that the world is real, okay? Why is that significant? Well, because there's a whole nother field of science, including a lot of physicists and neuro researchers who say that the world is not real. And you can pick up on this. There's more and more researchers saying that we live in a kind of computer simulation, right? Or that because our brains, and this is true of like Donald Hoffman. Has anyone heard of Donald Hoffman? He's also a neuro researcher, largely in the physiology of our eyes and the way that our eyes interact with light and objects in our brain to sort of shape and create the reality we perceive around us. Donald Hoffman, I hope I'm not misrepresenting him here, but I think he follows into the other side of naive realism is naive idealism, which says that because we can see through research the degree to which our brains so much construct the reality around us, we have to include that that reality doesn't really exist. All right? So these are popular ideas in science. If you are into science reading, you either have naive realism, everything exists outside of our perspective, and naive idealism, nothing exists because we can prove that our brains are active in sort of co-creating the world every time we see something, right? If you're interested in that, again, there's a lot of brain science in there, and I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to try to recreate that. But what McGilchrist is offering is a very different take. because he says both are probably wrong. And let me see if I can find, I'm not going to be able to find this section, but that's okay. I think, okay. These viewpoints, the two viewpoints I've just described, are closer than they look. One party fears that if what we call reality were in any sense contaminated by our own involvement in bringing it about, it would no longer be worthy of being called real. The other fears that since we manifestly do play a part in its coming about, it's already the case that it can't be called real. But just because we participate in reality doesn't mean we invent it out of nowhere, or solipsistically project it on some inner mental screen. Much less does it mean that the very idea of reality is therefore invalidated. So what McGilchrist is saying there is that he has a different take, and the take is this: we are co-creators every time we engage in an act of knowing our world. And this is a crucial element of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God. Adam and Eve, back in the book of Genesis, were very clearly called and given the vocation of participating in the unfolding and the completion of creation. And I've said this many times, there's mission exists in the garden before the fall. What is the mission in the garden before the fall? Fill the earth and cultivate it, right? We want to translate it, subdue it. And using our left brain world, we say subduing the earth in the Bible means use it however you want for your own benefit. That's not what it means biblically, right? Fill the earth and cultivate it so that the paradise of God spreads through the human person into all elements and aspects of creation, so that the meaning, the scopos, the teleology of all things are realized in the person of Christ, the Logos, the one in whom and by whom and for whom all things were made. Yes, John?
Something that sounded a lot like what you just said, out of one act of wisdom.
Okay.
St. Joseph has a cast, and I was just wondering, since he's kind of like a favorite saint, whether or not you've encountered anything like that.
Oh, absolutely. This is everywhere in our Orthodox tradition. So the question is this expressed in modern-day elders like St. Joseph the Hesychast? Absolutely. In fact, one of the remarkable quotes from that book is when he talks about what it means to pray truly, and he describes that if those who pray truly were to disappear from the earth, the very universe would sort of fold in and collapse on itself. That we are participants in creation. This is an Orthodox worldview, right? Our prayer is our participation in Christ, the Creator, who is filling all things by the Holy Spirit. Meaning that McGilchrist's take on this is very much lockstep with an Orthodox take, which says that the world here's the thing, and I know this sounds weird at times, but we shouldn't think of the world as existing apart from us, because biblically speaking, the human person is at the center of the universe, right? Particularly the Christ, the God-man, the incarnation. There is a sense in which what we call the universe is really dependent upon the fact that we are observing it. So we should be humble about ascribing a reality to the world as if the human being didn't exist and had no influence whatsoever in our experience of it being real. That would be to really remove the human person from the story. This is something that some fields of science are always doing. Everything is more natural with human beings not being a part of it. You know, have you ever noticed that? This is a hallmark of biology and conservation. Get human beings out of the natural world, right? Well, here's the problem. Your whole worldview says that human beings are nothing but the evolutionary unfolding of the natural world. So how can you say that the natural world is only truly natural when we get human beings out of it, right? What in your worldview accounts for the fact that human beings seem to change the world in every way that they touch it, right? This is part of the paradox of that worldview. We do participate in the reality of things. We do participate, and our spirit participates, our brain participates. I'll read a quote that will follow up, we'll finish up tonight with a quote from the Philokalia from Callistos, not Callistos Ware, a different Callistos, about just the way that prayer functions in this dimension. But we do participate, and that's not a problem. So there is, the matter with things is that they're real, but we can only speak of them being real from the human perspective, okay? This is going to become obvious in our spiritual lives as we take these sort of highfalutin ideas from Taylor and we get more granular now with the way our brains work and try to understand the way the world is, but more importantly, perhaps, the way we relate to the world and the way that each of us individually tries to make sense of the world that we live in. This is the primary benefit of this. It's where I can say that as I have read this book, it has, it leads to self-awareness in a way that can be uncomfortable but helpful. Another thing, so that's two idealisms, or naive idealism and naive realism that he's saying, let's not think of it that way. The other thing is this is very much a work about attention. Attention changes the world. How you attend to the world changes what it is you find there. What you find then governs the kind of attention you will think it appropriate to pay in the future. And so it is that the world you recognize, which will not be exactly the same as my world, is firmed up and brought into being. So how do we define attention? The best way that McGilchrist knows to put it is that it is the manner in which our consciousness is disposed towards whatever else exists. That is attention. What is attention? The way our consciousness is disposed towards whatever else exists. Do you see in that definition the relationship then to nominalism? If things exist, but their meaning is only there if I give it to it, that changes the way I think about what it is. But if things exist and there's a meaning and idea inherent to the thing itself that can only be revealed in the Logos of Christ, then the meaning of all things has to be revealed to me by grace, revealed to me by the Holy Spirit, which changes my relationship to my whole world. Everything becomes sacramental. By the way, interestingly, because of nominalism, you have this weird idea of how many sacraments are there, right? How many sacraments are there? Right? We want to say 7. We got that from the Roman Catholics. But notice this is interesting. So the real Orthodox answer is, how many sacraments are there? Well, there's innumerable. The whole world is sacramental because it all points to the Logos. Everything has a sacramental component. But we can say, well, when we read Scripture and we look at the tradition of the church, there are 7 primary sacraments, right? And then Protestants come along and they are desacralizing the world. They don't mean to, but they're shifting their relationship to the world. And they say, oh no, there's only 2 sacraments. Right? Protestants want to say the baptism and the Eucharist are the only 2 sacraments because those are the only ones that are most clear from Scripture, and all the rest are just made up by the Roman Catholics. And then you have even more radical Protestants like the Salvation Army or the Amish or the Quakers. There are no sacraments, right? There are no sacraments. The world is not sacramental, right? This is all part of the story. But here we are as the Orthodox. We think the whole thing is sacramental. We think the whole world is sacramental, so that matters. But it matters then in terms of the way we pay attention to it. And I love the story. I had a parishioner from a small village in Ukraine in my parish in Texas, and she described how for the whole week after Theophany, when they had gone out and they blessed the water and they blessed all their homes and they blessed the river that ran through their village, no one did any laundry or clothes or washing of any kind for 1 week out of respect for the blessed sacredness of the whole creation around them as a consequence of Theophany. Right? That is what we're talking about. That is a very different way of relating to the world, right? But it's because you believe the world is sacred, and because you believe that by blessing the water and throwing it everywhere, it has made all things holy. And so we can't not wash forever, but we're at least going to give it a week where we respect the sacredness of what that's happened, all right? So what he's describing here is that this is what he means by attentiveness, and how we understand attentiveness and the way the world is affects how we relate to it. The choice we make of how we dispose our consciousness is the ultimate creative act, he writes. It renders the world what it is to us. It is therefore a moral act. Or he quotes a French philosopher, love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. Right? Love is a pure attention to the existence of the other. So we could go on about that, but those two things I think are preliminaries. Now let me talk a little bit here, and we won't go too late because I know it's 8:22. We've got a little later start because of our great Vespers. So first of all, a couple of things about the brain that I'm going to say, and then we're going to move on from that, and I encourage you, read this. If you order it from Amazon, it'll be here in 1 or 2 days if you have Prime, and you can get right into this, and even if you just read the introduction, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, this is like the greatest thing I've ever read. The brain is asymmetrical in almost everything that can be measured at many levels in both its structure and function. Why? That's the first question. Why are our brains asymmetrical? 2, the power of the brain exists only through making connections through neurons. And the reach of that power depends on the number of connections it can make. Yet it is deeply divided down the middle. Why is that? Right? There's an actual fibrous connection between the two hemispheres of the brain called the corpus. I want to say the corpus callosum, but I think McGilchrist calls it callosum. The corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. So that's my instinctive. Yeah, that's the Pittsburgh way of describing of pronouncing corpus callosum. But it's a fibrous connection between the two brains. One of the reasons why we can talk about this, and this is a central part of this book, is that when you understand that trauma to the right-hand side of the brain, or the right side of the brain, tends to cause a certain change in how you perceive reality, and trauma to the left side of the brain has a different effect. It affects language and motion much more. That is part of the research behind all this. And again, I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but please read the book. It's deeply divided down the middle. So the principal band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres at their base in humans, known as the corpus callosum, has gotten proportionately smaller, not larger, over evolution, and is, in any case, to a large extent, inhibitory in function. It doesn't make the brain, the two halves of the brain connect more, it actually inhibits their connection. Why is that? Now, he does proffer an answer here. It is a hypothesis, and it's one that doesn't have, in evolutionary biology, a better explanation. And it's very simple. It's this, that in order for organisms to survive, they've got to do two things. They've got to eat, and they've got to not be eaten. And those are two different ways of paying attention to the world, right? So if you think of a bird has to determine the difference between a seed and a pebble or a grain of sand. And so they've got to pay granular attention to the details of their environment to find food, pick it out, and eat it. But at the same time, they have a different kind of attention that has to be paying attention to what's around them. What do I hear? I don't know if birds smell, but this is true of all organisms in a sense. What is my environment, and is there a threat? All right? The threat environment has to be the consequence of paying attention to a much broader perspective on my environment. To get food, I've got to be really detail-oriented, but to prevent myself from being eaten, I've got to kind of keep one eye open to all of this. And so one theory about why our brains are divided is that there are essentially two ways of knowing our world that are important to us, and they're very different ways of knowing the world. Okay? They need each other. You need one way of paying attention to the details to find the food that you need, but you also need this other side to be aware of danger around you, right? So that's one theory, but again, the book is filled with all kinds of interesting things like that. sometimes there's whole pages of side notes. So let me do this. I want to, are there any questions or any, yes? Yes.
Research on that, and that's a real challenge in terms of education.
Yeah.
I could see it even playing out, religiously, because your brain is always looking for something new.
Yes.
And that's why it's hard to focus attention.
Right.
And when things start to get known, or you perceive that, we've already done this litany.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what's for dinner tonight? Or
right.
What am I going to do when I leave here? Like it's a challenge to control the brain because it always wants to find something new.
Yes.
To focus on. So kids with phones, that's now
right.
their new reality. So
right.
in the classroom, it's a challenge.
Yeah. And I would say too, I mean, even for me, I know what it feels like to get sucked into that, especially if I'm bored or if I'm just too tired to read books like this, right? I know that pleasure zone of just in my phone looking for something that's going to be interesting, and it's just keep scrolling, and you're looking for novelty because there's a pleasure center in your brain that responds to that, and our phones provide us in some ways, both the fulfillment and the illusion of an eternal source of novelty. Yeah, there is. He does talk about that, and actually we'll hit on some of that right now. So first of all, these are a list of 20 things that are the different ways that the left hemisphere of our brain and our right hemisphere of our brain interact with the world. These are the differences. There's a lot of similarities, of course, too, and they need each other. This isn't one is better than the other. But number one, the left hemisphere is principally concerned with manipulation of the world. The right hemisphere with understanding the world as a whole and how to relate to it. Right? The left hemisphere very good at manipulating the world. This is really foundational to his entire thesis. These are well-known features of all neurobiological research. Okay, by manipulation of the world, what we'll see a lot of this and you can test for this. Notice or remember, if you remember from science, your left brain controls the right side of the body. And when we talk about understanding something, we talk about grasping it, right? That's an image that we all intuitively understand. But notice that grasping is something that most of us are right-handed, and we grasp something to control it, to subdue it, and to manipulate it, right? There's a physical component to knowing that's directly related to the relationship of the left brain to the right side of our organism, especially our limbs. And what's interesting about this is that when we talk with our hands, right, there's an understanding the language center is in the left part of the brain, and there's an understanding that gesticulating is perhaps rooted, and this again would be an evolutionary biology point of view, is rooted in the development of language. So much so that people born without limbs will experience phantom limb movement precisely related to language. They will feel a non-existent limb gesticulating and moving when they talk, even though they've never had one. So that you can't say, oh, you're just remembering how that felt like. They've never had one. It's because there's some kind of connection in the brain. But it's the left brain that wants to grasp the world. And it's a good way of remembering this, to manipulate it and to reduce it. Okay? The right brain is better at understanding the world as a whole, seeing how everything co-inheres and correlates and how we relate to it. That's a different way of knowing. Both are useful. Both are necessary. But one, clearly, we're going to see is more instrumental in understanding the way the world is. The left hemisphere deals preferentially with detail, the local, what is central and in the foreground and easily grasped, right? The right hemisphere with the whole picture, including the periphery or background and all that is not immediately graspable. The importance of the global or right hemisphere and local or left hemisphere distinction cannot be overstated. It is also extremely robust. There's lots of evidence from a scientific point of view for this. Perhaps, or I won't quote this. All right. The right hemisphere is on the lookout for, better at detecting and dealing with whatever is new. Novelty seeking. That's the right side of our brain is always looking for the new. The left hemisphere with what is familiar. And the more we're trained to use the left hemisphere, the more we're comfortable with the familiar. There's a whole chapter in this book on autism, and I know autism probably affects all of our lives through our own families or people that we know. But notice that in a lot of autistic people, whether they're picture thinkers or pattern thinkers or verbal thinkers, the familiar is very comforting for them. And as soon as you break the familiar, they start self-soothing, right? Autism is, we don't want to be reductionistic here, but autism is often associated with right hemisphere pathology. We don't understand that, or they don't, I'm not saying we as if I'm a biologist. They don't understand exactly how that works. It's a very complicated thing, but we can see how some of this might work. All right. The right hemisphere is sometimes called the devil's advocate, since it acts as an anomaly detector, on the lookout for what might be erroneously assumed by the left hemisphere to be familiar. So there you have that evolutionary idea. The right hemisphere is what looks for threats and changes in the environment. That's where the novel seeking comes in, whereas the left hemisphere is focused on the details. The left hemisphere aims to narrow things down to a certainty, while the right hemisphere opens them up into possibility. The right hemisphere is able to sustain ambiguity and the holding together of information that appears to have contrary implications without having to make an either-or decision, and to collapse it as the left hemisphere tends to do in favor of one of them. Right? It doesn't collapse it, in other words. So in other words, the left hemisphere favors the sort of reduction and simplification of our understanding of the world and a problem that we're working on. The right hemisphere is better at letting the ambiguity sort of function on its own, for its own reason. I'll give examples of how reading this book has helped me understand some things that I have changed about the way that I pastor a congregation, for instance, because this is all incredibly relevant, right? In line with this, the style of the right hemisphere is altogether more circumspect than that of the left hemisphere, which tends to be less self-critical. One of the crucial aspects of his research demonstrates that the left hemisphere of the brain is not very good at seeing the whole, but is very confident that it knows the whole thing. And that's what makes the left hemisphere a good servant but a bad master. It's not good at not knowing what it doesn't know, right? The right hemisphere is more, it's associated more with humility. I think I understand this, but wait, there might be additional data points, if you will. Let's wait to integrate those things. That's what our right side does. And I know we have to close up here, but a few more of these. The left hemisphere tends to see things as isolated, discrete, fragmentary, while the right hemisphere tends to see the whole. The left hemisphere tends to see things as put together mechanically from pieces and sees the parts rather than the complex union that the right hemisphere sees. Again, great example. Both are necessary, but these are different ways of knowing the whole thing. The left hemisphere's world tends towards fixity and stasis, that of the right hemisphere towards change and flow. The ability to be comfortable with change and flow has to do then with a very exercised right brain way of apprehending reality and comprehending the whole thing. The left hemisphere tends to see things as explicit and decontextualized, where the right hemisphere tends to see them as implicit and embedded in a context. As a result, the left hemisphere largely fails to understand metaphor, myth, irony, tone of voice, jokes, humor more generally, and poetry, and tends to take things literally. So this gets back to some of those, they're very left-brained, right? Is they want to work with math, but they don't get poetry at all. Okay, there is truth to that. But it's not because someone is left-brained. It's because they've been trained to apprehend and grasp reality using mainly their left brain. And really the whole point of all of this, of what McGilchrist is saying, is if we let the work of the left brain integrate with the work of the right brain, we tend to see everything more. You can't be, and let's sort of call him out here for being a polymath. How do you have, he's got a PhD and he's got an MD and he's also got PhDs in philosophy and literature, right? Well, that means he's a very whole-brained person. He's really good at using both sides. But that's precisely why he's able to make, I think, some of these observations. There is a tendency for the left hemisphere to prefer the inanimate, the right hemisphere, the animate. Machines and tools are alone coded in the left hemisphere, while the animate is coded by both hemispheres, though preferentially by the right hemisphere. Right? Very, very interesting. Here's an example of this very briefly. I'm fascinated with things like woodworking, and I love the result of woodworking, but when I watch videos of people actually doing woodworking, I almost get like anxious at all the details that are involved and all the tools that need to be mastered. And in order to make this cut, we've got to make this jig. But in order to make this jig, we've got to make that jig first. And before you know it, there's 180 steps just to make a single cut on your way to making a single dresser, right? And like, I am so right-brained on this, if I can blow this up a little bit, because I like the result and I'm interested in the process, but when I see the process, I want nothing to do with that, right? Nothing to do with that. I like the idea of becoming a woodworker as a hobby. I think it would be good for me, and no way can I relate to that. It's just because I'd rather read poetry, okay? So again, this is sort of like self-awareness. The right hemisphere understands narrative. The left hemisphere, this is interesting, the left hemisphere, if offered a story whose episodes are taken out of order, tends to regroup those episodes so as to classify similar episodes together, rather than reconstruct them in the order that has human meaning, right? In other words, it sees patterns that it wants to group and systematize, whereas the right hemisphere is looking for narrative connection. It's a very different way, again, of relating to the world. You need both. Both hemispheres need to categorize, but do so according to different strategies. The left hemisphere tends to categorize using the presence or absence of a particular feature. The right hemisphere tends to do so by reference to unique exemplars, or a family resemblance approach, or gestalt. It sees the whole. Let me skip down. These are interesting. For most of us, music is very largely the province of the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere dealing only with simple rhythms. The right hemisphere is essential for theory of mind, that is to say, what it is better able to understand, that is to say that it is better able to understand another's point of view. The right hemisphere is essential for empathy. That's probably not a surprise to anyone. In very general terms, both emotional receptivity and expressivity are greater in the right hemisphere. This is interesting. The left hemisphere is unreasonably optimistic, and it lacks insight into its own limitations. The right hemisphere is more realistic, but tends towards the pessimistic, which in some ways is counterintuitive, I find. But anyway, I didn't read all of them, but this is what we're talking about. These are two very different ways of paying attention to the world. The intention is for us to use a whole mind approach. And I want to just read what that looks like from the Philokalia, and this is Texts on Prayer by the Blessed Patriarch Callistos, when he's talking about the life of prayer, but very much apropos to these things that we're talking about. And I hope it'll sort of give us our guideline for why we're doing this. It's interesting, but it's more than interesting, it's essential. And this is why. It is the task of the cognitive aspect, here he says of the monk's life, but it's because he's writing to monks. He really is talking about the spiritual life in general. So we can say that the Orthodox Christian's life. It is the task of the cognitive aspect of the Orthodox Christian's life not only to know through ascetic practice the right use of mind and speech, of reason and sense perception, but also to determine how to give what is needful to the insensitive and appetitive powers. In short, the Christian has to learn accurately how to combine in the right way the measured and ordered harmony of the soul's faculties with the mind's inalienable knowledge, and to play a noetic melody, sweeter than any other, that unites ascetic practice and contemplation. In other words, the life of prayer is precisely the thing that puts our world together and promotes fullness of perception, where we're using both sides of the brain in ways of attention that are appropriate to each, but integrative to a whole. It is precisely prayer and the ascetical life that enables us to do this, and that breaks us out of the tendencies that were drilled into us by our education, and most of us are left-brained by education. Even if we tend to be more right-brained as people, we really have a left-brained way of paying attention to the world. This is true no matter what field you're in. In the academic world, whether you're doing a PhD in history or doing a PhD in physics, both those departments are going to require a completely left hemisphere approach to the scientific collection of data and the attendance to details. This is where the specialization of the university comes in, the specialization of research. This is all very left-brained in its origin. We have all of us have been educated precisely in an environment that says that the left hemisphere way of paying attention is the only one that matters if you're really educated. It's the only one. The right, it's fine for hobbies, right? It's okay, right? It's the difference, too, between a publication for a scientific academic audience, almost entirely left-brain, doesn't matter what the field is. It could be in the humanities or in the sciences or in math. It's all left-brain. We get into right-brain stuff only when we publish popular science. And notice that there's already a pejorative sense of that. When a scientist writes something for a popular audience, he makes broader connections. He uses or she uses a more right-brained way of perceiving things, but that's not taken very seriously as genuine research or scientific literature. Everything is left-brained. So the point of all of this is that it is the life of prayer, in fact, that puts together and integrates the whole of who and what we are and the way that we apprehend reality. And this is what's so exciting about this, because it's a different angle. If Taylor was describing the angle from history and philosophy of how the world got to be the way that it is, what McGilchrist is showing is that part of that story is the way we learned to pay attention to the world using only and predominantly one half of our brain, and that it has created a warp in our perception of what is real, particularly as Orthodox Christians outside these walls, outside the temple, which is, of course, this sacred, enchanted world. We experience the world as mundane because we've learned how to pay attention to it as a mundane reality, right? How do we break that? That is the journey that McGilchrist is offering us through his book, but it's also the journey that Orthodoxy gives to us as part of the spiritual life. So the rest of our time, we're integrating these two journeys as a way of helpfully understanding the world that we are shaped by, which is our educational and our epistemological and philosophical preconditions outside of Orthodoxy, and the very enchanted sacred world of Orthodoxy that's calling us to be and to relate to what is in a very different way. We've got to bring those things together, right? That's our task. Hopefully, we can do it justice.